In today's video, I want to talk about emptiness and not self. So Sunyata is emptiness and Anatta is not self, and define these terms in early Buddhism and explain a little bit how they're related. Um, so first of all, I wanted to talk about self and not self. So what do we mean by not self in early Buddhism? Not self is the third of the three perceptions that the Buddha talks about, and it was the second major discourse that he gave. So the first discourse he gave was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which was the turning of the wheel. That's when he talked about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. Um, and then, one of his five former partners in the holy life, one of the five ascetics, entered the stream at that point. They became a stream enter. They saw that all arising phenomena are already passing away, or all arising phenomena are already decreasing phenomena. It's a little bit how the 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 phrase of when the Dhamma eye opens is translated. Um, and then the other four, they heard it. They heard that first discourse, but they weren't sort of provoked to stream entry or any of the other three paths and fruitions. So in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which is the sutta teaching about not self, not only the one who entered the stream, but the other four all became arahats, fully awakened beings at once. So this is a significant teaching. So what is self and not self? Um, the teaching on not self, as I said earlier, is the third of the three characteristics or the three perceptions. The first being dukkha and anicca, which the Buddha covered in that first discourse. And then the third perception is not self. And these three perceptions are sort of, as Ramana Maharishi had said, they're like the thorn that you use to remove the thorn. So the purpose of the three perceptions is to take the mind off of its attachments. It's to sort of they're perceptual antidotes, as I like to say. So they're antidotes to perceptual mistakes, and they're antidotes to attachment to experience. So not self, it's not self itself. Not self is to take the mind away from its process of identification, personification, and possessiveness. I like to look at it this way because I like to look at language. So you can think of it as helping the mind to stop its I making, me making, my making, and even the sort of you, he, she, they making, right? So we take self out of our perception. Um, but to understand not self, you first have to understand what self is. And I hear a lot of discussions on this. And the point I'm about to make, I haven't heard made before. But this is how I experience self and not self in my own practice. So what I've come to realize is that the feeling of self exists on a sliding scale from very strong to very weak to not at all. When the sense of self is at its strongest is when we are very, very emotional, attached to a view or a desire. Say we're trying to get somewhere and somebody gets in our way, and then all of a sudden the body tightens up, or say somebody insults us or someone or something that we love and we get very tight. So there's this very strong sense of self in that moment. And then if you've experienced deep relaxation, if you've experienced deep meditation, or if you've just been in a very lighthearted mood or been around very just naturally lighthearted people, the sense of self in those situations is very, very faint. So why is this? The way that I've seen it is that the self is the shadow of craving. It's the shadow of desire. So the self is not the thing that's actually there. It is an epiphenomena in the same way that a shadow is an epiphenomena. A shadow is not actually there. It is created by the combination of other phenomena, right? So when the sun rises and its light hits a tree, the tree casts a shadow instantaneously. The moment the sun makes contact with the tree, the shadow of the tree appears. But the shadow is not actually there. Um, it is the result of the contact with the tree. Um, and that's the same thing with the self. So the self is the shadow of craving, in that whenever craving arises in the mind, and so at any time there's a desire for something, or a desire to push something away or get rid of it, or there's a sense of confusion about an object of perception, uh, craving arises in the mind, and then tension arises from that craving. And that feeling in the body of tension is what we call ourselves. Actually, self is stored throughout the body as tension. And when there's no tension in the body, the sense of self is just about not there. So that's why you can experience momentary glimpses of non-self when you get a deep massage, or you come out of a great meditation, or when you're just in a lighthearted, happy mood, because the sense of tension is very weak. And this is why also people cling to their views, their beliefs, their anger, their emotions, because it makes the sense of self very strong. Um, and we want the feeling of self. This is what we call the sense of self. A lot of times, truth is revealed through language. The feeling of self is actually a sensation in the body, and it's the sensation of craving. So self and craving are interdependent, and this is why even when somebody realizes the fictitious nature of that perception, if they still have craving, they still have the sensation, because everything goes from sensation to perception to thinking to proliferation. That's the process of dependent origination. So you may get rid of the perception of self if you understand a talk like this, like I'm giving now, but you'll never get rid of the sensation of self as long as craving is still in the body. So beginning sort of by dismantling the belief or the perception of self. Um, if this is the first video of mine you're watching, this will be the first time hearing this analogy. If not, this will be not the first time you hear this analogy. But in the same way that we look at elements of nature that have come into contact in certain combinations and give rise to certain conditions, like a storm, for example, and we can personify that storm as gods getting angry, and then the personification of that storm and the gods becoming angry can turn into fear and anxiety, and then that feeling of fear and anxiety can turn into rites and rituals and superstitions, practices to control that fear and anxiety. We do the exact same thing to what the Buddha called the five aggregates, which are the five constituents of experience. Our phenomenological first-person experience of the world. That is physical form, so that's the sensations of the body and its senses, feeling, perception, thinking, and sensory consciousness. These are the constituents of our experience, and these are different collections of processes in the body-mind that together give rise to experience. And what we do is we look at these processes and make the same mistake that our ancestors made in looking at processes of nature, and we personify those processes as me and mine and I. And then since we do that to ourselves, we do it to others, and the world becomes filled with selves, when in reality it's merely filled with nature going about its activities, energy coming into matter, matter going into energy, and just various complex processes coming in and out of form. And the perception and experience of self really creates a separation in experience. It creates experience and an experiencer rather than a continuous process of experiencing, which makes us feel isolated and scared. The fear of death really comes from the perception of self. In fact, in Buddhism, when we talk about birth and death, we're really talking about the birth and death of that self view. Without the birth of a self, there is no death. Death depends on birth, so does aging and illness, and so does suffering. All of these things depend directly on birth. And birth itself depends on clinging, which is identification. It's that process of storytelling that we use in the mind after we've identified with craving, and craving is what gives birth to craving, to self and suffering. So this is the process of dependent origination. And so the perception of non-self is when the mind can see clearly through this fiction that I am the body, the mind, and all of the processes of the body-mind complex. And again, seeing through that perception is one step. Getting rid of the belief is one step, but until craving is uprooted, you'll still have the sensation of self arising. That's why you can hear people talk about understanding not self quite frequently, but they'll still talk about feeling that subjective experience of being a self, which the Buddha talks about that as the I, or the conceit, which is a little bit harder to get, a lot of it harder to uproot. You have to quench craving in order to get rid of that, which takes a lot more work. Nature gave us craving for a reason. It gave us craving so that we, eat, drink, reproduce, protect ourselves, and all those things. And what the Buddha taught basically is that if we gain enough wisdom and knowledge and vision of the way things are, is that we no longer have to depend on these natural drivers to survive. We can use knowledge and wisdom and mindfulness to meet our requisite needs and live a much lighter, happier life, a life free of suffering, actually, a life free of craving. So I might come back to non-self, but how does it relate to emptiness? And is emptiness in early Buddhism the same as emptiness in the later traditions, in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana traditions? Yes and no. So the notion of emptiness that most people are probably familiar with in the West comes from the northern traditions, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, which is based on a philosopher named Nagarjuna's articulation of what emptiness is. So his articulation of emptiness is pretty much exactly stemming from the Buddha's teaching on not self, which is that he used the analogy of a chariot. He said when a chariot is together, we can identify a chariot. What is a chariot? Where is it? Well, if we take it down into its constituent parts, we'll find that there is no chariotness there. That really, at the moment all of the parts come together, then the chariot appears. The chariot is really the quality of all of the parts and the function of all the parts coming together, and this is what we call a chariot, and this is what he called emptiness. So it's really the emptiness of self that is discussed in these later traditions, and the emptiness of all phenomena. We can break anything in nature down into its constituents, and as you've seen in modern science, if we keep breaking things down, we see that they truly are empty. When we look deep into an atom, they keep coming up with smaller and smaller and smaller particles every time I look back, and I think that I remember the smallest particle, they found smaller particles. And then they're not sure if they're even particles all the time. They're waves of potential, and then they're particles, and then they're not. So on the material level, which I say knowing that I'm still speaking about the phenomenological level, because no matter what we talk about, we can only talk about reference to our experience, and that's where Buddhism really stays. It stays in the phenomenological realm and doesn't make claims about metaphysical or ontological reality. It makes observations and analyses about the nature of experience and how we can deconstruct that experience to have a much freer, liberated mind, a mind that is completely free of craving and suffering, which is a phenomenal experience. So that emptiness is actually comes from the early text, but it's much more focused on in later traditions, and I'm going to illustrate it. I like to illustrate it this way. So here you have the ground of all being, the ground of your experience, right? This white background. Now I'm gonna draw a really bad circle. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Boom, right? So right at the moment that this really awful circle closed, it didn't really close, okay? Right at the moment the circle closed, the concept inside and outside co-arose, right? They arose dependent on the figure of the circle arising, and they arose codependent at the exact moment the circle closed, the exact moment of contact. Um, but inside and outside are like the self epiphenomena. They are concepts arising in the mind at the moment of contact. Once the circle closes, inside and outside appear. There was no inside and outside before the circle arose, and there's no inside and outside actually now. It's really just a concept dependent on the figure of the circle. So what this is an analogy of is a little bit of both non-self and this first definition of emptiness I'm talking about. So at every moment of sensory contact, when an eye meets a visual object and consciousness arises, there is contact, and that is the fundamental experience of seeing. At that exact moment, the concept of seer and seen arises, when in reality there is no seer and there is no seen, there is only the process of seeing, right? So if you take the away and you take the in away, the subject and the object, then there's only the process that's left. Same thing when hearing, right? When the ear makes contact with sound, and consciousness arises, it all co-arises at the same moment. These three things come together. Then there is the experience of hearing, and then the mind basically fabricates the hearer and the heard. When in fact there is no hearer and there's no heard, there's only the process of hearing. The Bahia Sutta, which is quite popular, is mistranslated, according to Bhante Punjabi, as in the seen there's only the seen, in the heard there's only the heard, in the sense, in the smelled there's only the smelled, in the sense there's only the sensed, and all that, right? When actually what he apparently had said, the Buddha had said to Bahia, according to Bhante Punjabi, is my son is awake, is that in the seen, there's only the seeing. In the heard, there's only the hearing. In the sensed, there's only the sensing, right? So it's not this subject and object, there's only the process when you see through this illusion. Which is what Nagarjuna was trying to point out in his chariot analogy. It's what I'm trying to point out in my storm analogy, and also in this perfect circle analogy, that at every moment's experience arises the epiphenomena of subject and object co-arise dependent on that phenomena. So the phenomena is there, and the epiphenomena of self is not there. And this arising experience gives rise to that epiphenomena when craving arises in response or in reaction to that experience. So the experience is there, so the contact and the feeling is there. The craving is a result of ignorance. That's there. But the self and all the stories that construct the self are really just sort of a, I guess for lack of a better word, a hallucination that the mind creates. And we suffer a lot because of that hallucination. So that's a little bit about self and the first definition of emptiness. The other two definitions of emptiness that are really more, you see a lot more in the early discourses of the Buddha, come off at first, I think, to people as less profound, but I think they're actually more profound if you look at the quality of your life. So in the discourses on emptiness, in the early discourses in the Pali Canon, firstly, the Buddha defines emptiness as empty of what's not there. Now, the Buddha used terms like emptiness, like nibbana, because he was trying to ensure that people did not create concepts out of what he was teaching. He said, okay, nobody can create a concept out of emptiness. And then the Northern Tradition said, the Mahayana said, hold my beer. We'll turn that into a concept, watch us. But he actually didn't use the noun form in this sutta. He used empty as an adjective. So there was sunya, not sunyata, right? And he defined it as empty of what's not there. So he started by saying, you know, monks were here in this forest. We could see that the forest is empty of the disturbance that would just depend on the perception of village, right? So you're no longer in the village. They were out on the alms round. Now they're in the forest. So whatever, when they were in the village, the perception of village was there, and the mental disturbance dependent on that perception was there. And now that they're in the forest, the perception of village is gone, and the mental disturbance dependent on that perception is gone. So there is that level, that first level of emptiness, right? Um, so this is profound, much more profound than it sounds like. Most of us walk around not empty, we walk around full. We walk around full of every experience we've ever had, and experiences and the disturbances dependent on that experience. So I could be sitting here right now, and my mind, instead of only having the perception of this room, could have the perception and the disturbance based on that perception of some early childhood experience, or some experience I had earlier in the day, or anxiety about something I have to do later, or anticipation of what and then the tension that's related to that, and then all of the mental proliferations, all the stories and narratives that we create dependent on that perception. So that's non-emptiness, right? But a mind that is stilled and clear from practice is empty in every moment of what is not present. So it has what's present, it has whatever perceptions are there, and it's empty of what's not there. So it's basically complete presence in this moment. It's what we call, um, presence. Eckhart Tolle calls presence, or being here now, right? Which most of us truly aren't, because we're creating a past, we're creating a future, and we're manufacturing and creating the present moment. So we're never actually empty. So abiding in emptiness is really having a mind that is completely clear and absent or empty of what is not there. And 99% of our lives, nothing bad is really happening, but we're worrying about something bad happening, or thinking about something so-called bad that did happen, and we're suffering for it. So that's a whole lot of non-emptiness that we have in the mind. So that's why this is really profound. To have a mind that is truly empty of what is not there is a really profound experience, and something that we should practice. You can practice emptiness. Use that liberation equation of dukkha, dukkha, nirodha. So nirodha, the non-emptiness, right? Bring the non-emptiness to cessation, and really come back to what is actually present. Just the body, mind, and whatever is being perceived and experienced in this moment, and nothing else needs to be manufactured out of it. And the next definition of emptiness is really just a deeper form of this emptiness, right? It's the emptiness of, it's the meditative experience of emptiness. So it's that is dependent on this emptiness I'm talking about now. So being in the forest, or here in my house, let's say I'm a teacher, right? I keep bringing this up. So when I'm at work, I have the perception of students and work, and the disturbance depend on that. But when I come home, my experience is empty of work, of students, and the disturbance dependent on that. And so that's this level of emptiness, right? Empty of what's not there. So let's say I sat down, rested my attention on the breath, and allowed the mind to shed its processes, which is what happens as you go deeper and deeper into jhana, right? First, you shed the perceptions of the sensory experience. Eventually, the perception of the body vanishes. At least this is the kind of the way it goes for me. The external senses go, then the internal sense of body goes. Then there's sort of just the sensation of thinking, verbal thinking. Then that goes, and then there's strong, very strong sense of joy from the relief of the world and the self coming off the shoulders. That comes, and then that settles down into a calmer happiness, and then eventually that goes, and then there's only sort of just this resting awareness, and then even that goes. So these are different. Each level of cessation is an emptiness of not what is not there previously, right? So first there's the emptiness of the sense experience, and then all of the thinking that came with you, right, about previous experiences. In fact, if you can start in that first emptiness, you'll get much further. And then there's the emptiness of, like I said, the sensory realm. Then there's the emptiness of the body. Then there's the emptiness of the verbal thinking, the verbal formations. And then there's the emptiness of that first level of rapture. Then there's the emptiness of that second calmer feeling of bliss. Then there's the emptiness of uh, of all of the sort of emotional tones, and there's just this sort of still awareness, and then even that vanishes, and there's just a complete emptiness. So that's the emptiness as a meditative experience, but it's really related to the emptiness of what's not there, emptiness, right? So oftentimes we make a mistake in understanding these things when we turn adjectives into nouns. Even nibbana is an adjective. It means cool, right? It means when something is cool. And when we turn nibbana into a noun, we turn it into a thing. Empty means empty of what's not there, which is an adjective. And when we turn empty into emptiness, we kind of turn it into a thing to chase after. So we have to be careful not to nominalize um, these concepts. They're really meant as perceptual tools to bring the mind out of its suffering, out of all of this disturbance that it experiences, into deeper and deeper experiences of psychological freedom. So that's another way you could think of emptiness as freedom. Let me know if you have any questions about non-self or emptiness, or if you want me to elaborate on any of the points that I made in the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe the video, and thank you for watching.